In the late 1930s, the Soviet Union found itself at a critical juncture in the development of its air force. While the world's major powers were investing heavily in modern monoplane fighters, the Soviet Air Forces, VVS, remained largely equipped with outdated biplanes such as the Polikarpov 15 and I-16. These designs, though innovative at their time of introduction, were rapidly becoming obsolete in the face of new combat doctrines and aircraft capabilities demonstrated during conflicts such as the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese-Soviet border clashes. Soviet military planners recognized the urgent need to modernize their fighter fleet with a new generation of fast, maneuverable, and well-armed monoplanes. In 1938, this strategic imperative gave rise to a new fighter competition issued by the Soviet government. The People's Commissariat of the Aviation Industry, NKAP, called upon design bureaus across the USSR to submit prototypes for a next-generation frontline fighter capable of confronting both existing threats and anticipated German developments. Among the entrants was a young and relatively untested designer, Alexander Yakovlev. Yakovlev's design bureau, until then known primarily for training aircraft like the UT-2, was not an obvious contender against more established names like Lavochkin and Polikarpov. However, Yakovlev understood the urgent needs of the VVS and proposed a lightweight, agile, and cost-effective fighter. His design concept emphasized simplicity, speed, and mass producibility, a departure from some of the heavier and more complex submissions. The initial concept, designated I-26, relied heavily on available resources and proven technologies. It utilized a mixed construction airframe, a steel tube fuselage with wooden skinning and wooden wings. This allowed it to be manufactured quickly using Soviet industrial capabilities, many of which were still recovering from Stalin's purges and lagged behind Western production methods. The chosen engine was the Klimov M105, a liquid-cooled V-12 based on a Hispano-Suiza design which provided a promising balance between power and reliability. Yakovlev's team worked intensively to meet tight deadlines with their prototype built in just over a year, a remarkable feat considering the technological leap involved. They faced numerous technical obstacles along the way, balancing structural strength with weight, integrating a closed cockpit for pilot protection and visibility, and ensuring the aircraft could be armed with at least one 20mm Shavaki cannon and a synchronized 7.62 KAS machine gun. Despite the youth and relative inexperience of Yakovlev's team, the I-26 made a strong impression during internal evaluations. Its sleek lines, respectable climb rate, and nimble handling characteristics marked a significant improvement over existing Soviet fighters. Even though it lacked the raw horsepower of some Western contemporaries, its aerodynamic efficiency and pilot-friendly controls made it immediately attractive for potential mass production. The political climate also played a crucial role in the Yak-1's advancement. Stalin's government was eager to showcase technological self-sufficiency and Soviet ingenuity, and Yakovlev, who had gained favor with high-ranking officials, found a receptive audience in the military establishment. The combination of technical promise and political support fast-tracked the I-26 through initial review stages and into the testing pipeline. As the geopolitical landscape darkened with Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 and the looming threat of war on the Eastern Front, the Soviet leadership intensified its demand for new combat aircraft. By early 1940, Yakovlev's prototype had evolved into a formal production model designated Yak-1, approved for limited initial production even before all trials were complete, a decision driven as much by necessity as by confidence. The Yak-1 thus emerged not merely as a technical innovation, but as a strategic response to a rapidly changing world. Its origins lay in both engineering pragmatism and the Soviet states' resolve to close the widening gap with potential adversaries. Though humble in appearance and born in a time of institutional uncertainty, the Yak-1 was about to prove itself as the cornerstone of a new Soviet fighter force, one that would face the Luftwaffe head-on in the greatest air battles of the 20th century. The transition from concept to reality began with the construction and evaluation of the first I-26 prototype in early 1940. The testing phase, overseen by both Yakovlev's bureau and state aviation officials, was crucial not only to assess flight performance, but also to determine the viability of rapid production. Initial flight tests were conducted at the Kodinka airfield near Moscow, where the aircraft revealed both promise and serious issues. The early prototypes suffered from a range of mechanical and aerodynamic problems: poor visibility from the cockpit, unreliable engine performance, and structural weaknesses in the wing spars that compromised safety under high-stress maneuvers. Despite these challenges, the Yakovlev team pushed forward with remarkable pace. Field adjustments were constant, involving iterative redesigns to the canopy structure, tail unit, and armament installation. The enclosed cockpit, originally introduced to improve pilot survivability and comfort, proved unpopular with test pilots due to limited rearward visibility. After several redesigns, including changes to the canopy frame and pilot seat position, a compromise was reached that provided sufficient visibility without compromising structural integrity. The Klimov M105 engine, though offering adequate power, proved temperamental in early trials. Engine overheating and lubrication failures were common, often caused by inconsistent quality in Soviet wartime manufacturing. Yakovlev's engineers modified the cooling system and worked closely with engine designers to ensure that the aircraft's power plant could endure extended combat operations. These adaptations delayed the final testing schedule but ultimately provided a more reliable platform for frontline service. Meanwhile, parallel tests evaluated armament efficiency. The Yak-1's firepower, centered on a nose-mounted 20mm HVK cannon firing through the propeller hub, was considered sufficient for engaging enemy fighters and light bombers. However, concerns were raised about the durability of the synchronization gear controlling the 7.62mm HAAS machine gun, particularly under sustained fire. Modifications were made to improve reliability, though many early production models retained only the cannon to simplify maintenance and reduce weight. As refinements continued, the Soviet authorities, impatient with the slow pace of domestic fighter modernization, authorized pre-series production. By late 1940, the first small batches of Yak-1s were assembled at Factory No. 292 in Saratov, a key industrial hub designated for wartime aircraft output. These early production models were still plagued by defects, including loose rivets, poor surface finish, and quality control inconsistencies. Yet their performance exceeded expectations once airborne, with agility and climb rates surpassing those of the I-16 and Yak-1 fighters then in service. The production process also revealed one of the Yak-1's long-term advantages: manufacturability. Unlike all-metal Western fighters, the Yak-1's mixed construction design allowed it to be built in factories with limited aluminum supplies. Its wooden components could be sourced and fabricated locally, enabling dispersed production even in wartime conditions. Furthermore, the aircraft's modularity simplified field repairs and parts replacement, a critical factor given the logistical constraints of the Eastern Front. By mid-1941, with the threat of war turning into reality, the Yak-1 had entered broader production despite lingering technical concerns. The Soviet Air Force ordered increasing numbers as losses mounted in the face of the German onslaught. Although the aircraft still lacked certain refinements, such as radios for communication and armor plating for the pilot in early units, field experience began to inform gradual improvements. The testing phase had served its purpose, identifying and resolving core design issues, preparing Soviet pilots for the shift from biplanes to monoplanes, and establishing the Yak-1 as a reliable foundation for subsequent variants. The urgency of war had compressed the usual development timeline, forcing a transition from test flights to combat deployment in a matter of months. Ultimately, the Yak-1's testing and prototype era was not defined by technical perfection, but by adaptability under pressure. Yakovlev's team demonstrated that innovation could flourish even under resource scarcity and political scrutiny. The lessons learned during this phase would shape not only the Yak-1's combat career, but also the future of Soviet fighter design throughout the war. The Yak-1 officially entered service with the Soviet Air Forces in early 1941, mere months before Operation Barbarossa commenced. As one of the first truly modern Soviet fighters, it represented a significant leap over previous frontline aircraft, offering enclosed cockpits, retractable landing gear, and improved armament. However, the timing of its introduction coincided with one of the most devastating moments in Soviet military history: the German invasion. This meant the Yak-1's entry into operational use was marked by immediate, unrelenting pressure and a shortage of trained pilots, mechanics, and support infrastructure. The first operational units equipped with Yak-1s included the 31st Fighter Aviation Regiment and the 124th Fighter Aviation Regiment. These units were rapidly mobilized to meet the advancing Wehrmacht, often before their crews had fully mastered the new aircraft or its maintenance requirements. Pilots transitioning from older types like the I-16 or I-153 faced a steep learning curve. The Yak-1's more sensitive controls, higher landing speed, and modern engine management systems required retraining, time that was in short supply during the chaotic first months of the war. Early combat deployments revealed a mixture of strengths and limitations. The Yak-1 was praised for its agility and responsiveness, particularly at low to medium altitudes, where much of the Eastern Front air combat occurred. It could outturn many German fighters, especially the early model Messerschmitt Bf-109s. However, it was underpowered in comparison to the Bf-109F and suffered from frequent mechanical issues, especially in its rushed early production models. Many pilots also lamented the lack of onboard radios, which hampered coordination during dogfights and defensive patrols. Nevertheless, Yak-1 squadrons quickly became active participants in defensive and offensive air operations across multiple fronts. They provided air cover for Red Army units, escorted ground attack aircraft such as the Il-2, and engaged in fighter sweeps to disrupt German air superiority. These missions often resulted in high attrition, not only due to enemy fire, but because of inexperience, poor logistics, and the general instability of frontline airfields during the first year of the war. Pilot feedback began to inform field modifications and upgrades. Commanders and technicians relayed data back to Yakovlev's bureau, who incorporated changes to armor protection, visibility enhancements, and engine reliability. These incremental improvements gradually improved pilot survivability and mission success rates. Over time, the average combat effectiveness of Yak-1 units rose, especially as new pilots gained experience, and replacement aircraft were delivered with updated features. One significant milestone in the Yak-1's early combat role was its participation in the Battle of Stalingrad. By late 1942, Yak-1 were among the most numerous Soviet fighters over the city, operating in support of both air superiority and ground support missions. Their agility and resilience in close-quarter combat proved valuable in the densely contested airspace. Soviet aces such as Lydia Litviak and Yekaterina Budanova flew Yak-1s during this period, becoming among the first female fighter pilots to achieve aerial victories. Operational deployment also illuminated the Yak-1's strengths in terms of maintenance and field repair. Although not immune to the mechanical failures common in early war Soviet aircraft, the Yak-1 could be patched and returned to service more easily than many of its contemporaries. This was critical on a front where spare parts were scarce, and field workshops operated under constant threat of air raids and advancing ground forces. Despite its imperfections, the Yak-1 established itself as a frontline fighter that could be relied upon in the most adverse conditions. It marked the beginning of a shift in Soviet air doctrine, one that moved away from quantity over quality and began to prioritize pilot survivability, aircraft performance, and unit cohesion. While not yet the dominant force in the skies, Yak-1 squadrons laid the foundation for the Soviet resurgence in air power, preparing the way for newer and more refined variants to follow. As the war progressed into 1942 and beyond, the Yak-1's role on the Eastern Front expanded significantly. Initially deployed as a general-purpose fighter, its combat use became increasingly specialized in response to evolving battlefield needs. While the early months of service had exposed limitations in reliability and armament, the aircraft's inherent maneuverability, structural resilience, and adaptability made it suitable for a wide array of frontline missions. By the middle of the war, the Yak-1 had shifted from merely a stopgap modern fighter to a central pillar in Soviet air strategy. In air-to-air combat, the Yak-1 found its niche at low and medium altitudes. While German Bf-109F and G models outperformed it in climb rate and top speed at higher altitudes, the Yak-1's turning radius and horizontal maneuverability remained excellent. Soviet tactics adapted accordingly, favoring defensive turning engagements, surprise attacks from lower altitudes, and cooperation between pairs or groups of fighters. The aircraft's central cannon, while slow-firing, proved devastating when it struck, particularly against lightly armored targets like reconnaissance planes and ground attack aircraft. Many Yak-1 pilots reported success by luring enemies into low-altitude fights, where the Yak's agility offered a distinct advantage. The aircraft's ruggedness under fire also became a notable asset. Pilots frequently returned to base with heavily damaged fuselages or wing sections, testimony to the forgiving nature of the Yak-1 structure. Unlike some Western aircraft built from all-metal designs, the Yak-1's mix of wood and metal construction absorbed damage in unpredictable, but often survivable ways. Its airframe could often be repaired with basic tools and field-expedient materials, allowing units to maintain operational tempo even in challenging conditions. In ground attack roles, while not initially intended for such missions, the Yak-1 was increasingly employed in strafing and close air support operations, especially during offensives like Operation Uranus and the subsequent Soviet counteroffensives around the Don and Volga rivers. Armed with underwing rockets or additional machine guns in some cases, Yak-1s would strike enemy troop columns, fuel depots, and supply lines. These missions were extremely hazardous given the intense concentration of German flak and machine gun fire, but the Yak's speed and handling gave pilots a better chance of escape than many other Soviet attack platforms. The Yak-1, Run, also played a key role in escorting Soviet bombers and ground attack aircraft such as the Pe-2 and Il-2. Escort missions became more frequent as the Soviet air forces transitioned to combined arms operations, and the Yak-1's balance of speed and endurance made it one of the more suitable platforms for such tasks. Pilots would often defend bombers deep into contested airspace, fending off interceptors and then turning to engage secondary ground targets on the return flight. Tactical innovation also evolved in tandem with the aircraft's use. Pilots developed wolfpack tactics, flying in coordinated formations to overwhelm enemy aircraft with numbers, rather than relying on individual dogfighting skill alone. Soviet command began to emphasize formation discipline, radio usage, where available, and debriefing to share lessons learned, improving squadron cohesion and operational efficiency. The Yak-1 proved compatible with this doctrine, especially as more units received improved models with better radios and minor performance tweaks. Nonetheless, the Yak-1's continued effectiveness relied on constant adaptation. The aircraft had reached the limits of what could be achieved with its initial airframe and engine combination, and while it remained in service, its frontline role gradually began to transition to that of an experienced workhorse, still capable but increasingly overshadowed by improved variants like the Yak-1B and its successors, the Yak-7 and Yak-9. These newer models incorporated many of the lessons learned from years of combat, including strengthened airframes, better visibility, more powerful engines, and additional armor. By late 1943, the Yak-1 had proven its worth through thousands of sorties and numerous air victories. It had not been a perfect machine, but it had been good enough. And more importantly, it had been there when needed most. In combat use, the Yak-1 displayed a rare combination of adaptability, resilience, and tactical utility that few early war Soviet fighters had matched. It was a fighter not only built for the battlefield, but shaped by it, evolving through necessity and hardened by fire. Its role as a reliable frontline tool had been firmly established, both as a defender of Soviet skies and a hammer against Axis lines. As the Yak-1 matured in service, the need for further development became evident. While the aircraft had proven itself in combat, Soviet engineers recognized that evolving threats and expanding mission profiles required improvements. This necessity led to a systematic evolution of the Yak-1 into several modified variants, each designed to enhance performance, survivability, or mission flexibility. These changes not only prolonged the aircraft's relevance on the Eastern Front, but also laid the groundwork for a family of fighters that would serve until the war's end. One of the most notable and successful variants was the Yak-1B, introduced in 1942. This version incorporated several key upgrades based directly on frontline feedback. It featured an improved canopy design that significantly enhanced rearward visibility, an important factor in air combat. The pilot's seating position was lowered, providing better protection and forward vision. Additionally, armored headrests and rear cockpit armor were added to increase pilot survivability during engagements and crash landings. These improvements made the Yak-1B far more competitive against newer German fighters like the Bf-109G. The Yak-1B also benefited from refinements to the Klimov M105P engine. Although still not as powerful as Western engines of the same class, it provided a modest performance boost and improved reliability, especially in cold weather conditions. Combined with aerodynamic streamlining and weight reduction in non-critical areas, the Yak-1B achieved a better climb rate and improved handling. The upgraded armament, consisting of a 20 mm Réchaud AVAK cannon and a single 12.7 mm UBS machine gun, struck a balance between firepower and weight, giving pilots sufficient punch without sacrificing agility. Beyond the Yak-1B, the development path of the Yakovlev fighter line diverged into related but distinct models. The Yak-7, originally conceived as a trainer derivative, was redesigned into a capable fighter bomber and long-range escort. It shared many components with the Yak-1, but featured a more robust airframe and the ability to carry bombs or drop tanks. This transformation demonstrated the flexibility of the original Yak-1 design and its capacity to form the basis for multiple aircraft types suited to varied roles. The Yak-9, arguably the most numerous and versatile of the Yakovlev fighters, also traced its lineage directly back to the Yak-1. It incorporated lessons from both the Yak-1 and Yak-7 with an all-metal fuselage, strengthened undercarriage, and increased fuel capacity. Different versions of the Yak-9 fulfilled diverse roles: long-range escort, ground attack, high-altitude interception, allowing Soviet commanders to tailor air operations with greater flexibility. The success of the Yak-9 confirmed that the Yak-1's design philosophy had been sound, even if it had been limited by wartime resource constraints in its original form. Technological evolution also extended to production methodology. Early war models of the Yak-1 had suffered from poor build quality, inconsistent materials, and limited standardization. As Soviet industry recovered and rationalized during the mid-war period, production techniques improved. Factories adopted more precise jigs, tighter tolerances, and better quality control procedures. Wooden parts were standardized, and subassemblies were made more interchangeable between aircraft. These refinements allowed for faster production rates, reduced logistical burdens, and more consistent field performance. Variants for specialized purposes were also explored. Some Yak-1 airframes were adapted for reconnaissance, featuring cameras and extended fuel tanks. Others served in training roles, particularly as twin-seat conversions to prepare new pilots for combat. While these versions never represented a large portion of the total Yak-1 fleet, they illustrated the adaptability of the platform and the effort to extract maximum utility from each airframe. International deployment of Yak-1s remained minimal due to the Soviet Union's limited aircraft export policy during the war. However, a small number were used by the Free French Normandy Niemen Regiment, who flew alongside Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front. These foreign pilots generally praised the Yak-1's flight characteristics and appreciated its nimble handling, even if it lacked the sophistication of Western aircraft they had previously flown. By 1944, the Yak-1 was gradually phased out of frontline service in favor of newer models, but it remained in second-line duties and training roles until the war's end. Its legacy persisted not just in its own performance, but in the technological and tactical framework it created for subsequent Yakovlev fighters. The aircraft's development trajectory was not just about building a better fighter, it was about learning to build better fighters in a time of national crisis. The Yak-1 had done more than fulfill a role. It had seeded a lineage that would shape the course of Soviet air power in World War II. The global impact and enduring legacy of the Yak-1 rest not in its proliferation abroad, but in its influence on Soviet aviation and its contribution to the eventual success of the Red Air Force during the Second World War. As one of the first modern monoplane fighters produced in significant numbers by the USSR, the Yak-1, Yak-1, played a critical role in transforming Soviet aerial warfare doctrine, production philosophy, and pilot training practices during a period of existential threat to the nation. It stood as a symbol of a maturing Soviet defense industry, capable of innovating under pressure and learning through hard-won experience. Unlike Western aircraft such as the Spitfire or P-51, the Yak-1 did not see widespread international service, largely due to Soviet strategic policy rather than lack of merit. The primary exception to this insular usage was the aforementioned Normandy Niemen Squadron, a Free French unit that flew alongside Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. Their use of the Yak-1 Faten followed later by the Yak-9 created one of the most unique transnational combat legacies of the war. The success and loyalty of the French pilots became a powerful propaganda tool for the Soviet Union and served as a symbol of Allied unity, especially after the war when Stalin gifted the French government surviving Yak aircraft as a gesture of respect. Within the USSR, however, the Yak-1's legacy was profound. Its success led directly to the mass production of over 36,000 Yakovlev fighters of various types, an industrial feat that made the Yak series the most numerous family of fighters ever built by the Soviet Union during the war. The experience gained in the design, production, and refinement of the Yak-1 was instrumental in shaping the capabilities and philosophy of the Yakovlev Design Bureau long after the war ended. Lessons learned about aerodynamic balance, modular construction, and pilot-centric design influenced post-war aircraft such as the Yak-15 and even early Soviet jets. The Yak-1 also played a formative role in shaping Soviet pilot culture. It was the aircraft in which many of the USSR's top aces, including Alexei Alelyukin, Lydia Litvyak, and Yekaterina Budanova, cut their teeth. The aircraft's forgiving handling and balanced control responses made it ideal for developing pilot confidence and aggression, particularly in the intense and unforgiving conditions of the Eastern Front. It enabled the creation of a new generation of Soviet aviators who transitioned from rudimentary trainers and obsolete biplanes to a frontline fighter capable of holding its own against the Luftwaffe. In the post-war period, the Yak-1 was gradually retired from service, with remaining aircraft either scrapped or repurposed for training duties. Its relatively fragile wood and metal construction meant that few original examples survived into the modern era. Nonetheless, several Yak-1s have been reconstructed from surviving components or built anew using original factory plans and vintage tooling, and today a handful exist in museums or private collections. These restored aircraft serve as tangible reminders of a design that, while often overshadowed by more famous contemporaries, played a decisive role in the air war over the Eastern Front. Culturally, the Yak-1 has undergone a modest re-evaluation in recent years, particularly in Russia and Eastern Europe. As historical focus shifted beyond Cold War-era glorification of Soviet achievements, a more balanced view emerged, one that recognized the aircraft's limitations and vulnerabilities, while also appreciating its timely contributions and its place in Soviet aviation history. Documentaries, memoirs, and historical studies have explored the stories of the pilots who flew the Yak-1, particularly female aviators who became iconic figures in Soviet wartime propaganda and post-war memory. While the Yak-1 may not command the same level of global recognition as some Allied or Axis fighters, its influence is undeniable. It was a product of necessity that evolved into a keystone of Soviet resilience and adaptation. More than any individual engagement or statistic, the Yak-1's legacy is found in what it made possible. The sustained presence of the Red Air Force in critical theaters of war, the development of a lineage of fighters that carried the Soviets to aerial dominance by 1945, and the empowerment of a new generation of combat pilots forged under fire. In this regard, the Yak-1 was more than a machine, it was a turning point in Soviet military aviation. Though the Yak-1's main chapters are firmly established in the annals of Soviet aviation history, a number of lesser-known missions and obscure adaptations add depth to its legacy, unseen threads in the larger tapestry of World War II aerial warfare. These overlooked operations and variant roles reveal how the aircraft and the teams that operated it continuously sought to stretch its potential beyond standard frontline duties. In many cases, this was born not from ambition, but from necessity, a reflection of the constant demand for innovation on a war-torn front. Among the most notable of these forgotten chapters were experimental reconnaissance adaptations of the Yak-1. While never mass-produced, some frontline units modified existing aircraft by installing camera equipment in the rear fuselage or underwing pods. These aircraft were used for tactical reconnaissance missions, often at great personal risk to the pilot. Operating without escort and at low altitudes, these missions provided critical battlefield imagery for Soviet planners during major offensives, particularly in the Ukraine and Belarusian campaigns. Despite lacking the range and specialized equipment of dedicated recon platforms like the PE-2, these modified Yak-1s were quick and agile enough to avoid interception, and their success highlighted the versatility of the airframe. In parallel, engineers at the Yakovlev Design Bureau explored modifications for high-altitude flight and alternative power plants. One such experimental variant involved testing upgraded versions of the Klimov M105 engine with improved supercharging systems to enhance performance at altitude. These tests were part of a broader Soviet effort to counter the Luftwaffe's growing use of high-altitude bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Though that Yak-1 at the Zayovi Yak-1 was ultimately not the platform that fulfilled this role in combat, the data collected fed into subsequent models like the Yak-3 and Yak-9D, influencing their design toward better performance in the upper air layers. Additionally, several twin-seat trainer variants of the Yak-1 were fielded on a limited basis. With the war's relentless attrition consuming trained pilots at an alarming rate, the Soviet Union needed to accelerate the training pipeline. Engineers modified Yak-1 airframes to include a second cockpit, sometimes at the expense of fuel capacity or armament, to allow for in-air instruction. These aircraft were crucial in preparing rookie pilots for the demands of combat flight. Although vulnerable and lightly armed, they enabled instructors to bridge the gap between classroom instruction and real-world conditions, particularly in the harsh environments near the front lines. Less documented but historically significant was the use of damaged Yak-1s as stationary ground trainers or as decoys. In some cases, airframes too damaged to be flown were repurposed for gunnery practice, cockpit familiarization, or even battlefield deception. Camouflaged and positioned to resemble operational aircraft, these hulks drew enemy fire away from functional squadrons or misled German reconnaissance units about Soviet air strength in a given sector. This form of improvisation exemplified the Red Army's broader philosophy of resource maximization under duress. A handful of wartime documents also suggest that the Yak-1 was briefly evaluated as a platform for early radio-guided drone control. Though no direct combat use has been confirmed, engineers investigated the possibility of using fighters like the Yak-1 to direct unmanned explosive-laden aircraft against fortified enemy positions. These experiments paralleled similar efforts in Germany, the United States, and the United Kingdom, though none reached maturity in the Yak-1's case. The project was likely shelved due to a lack of sufficient radio equipment and more pressing tactical priorities. Finally, reflections from veteran pilots who flew the Yak-1 in these non-standard roles provide rare and valuable insight into the aircraft's adaptability. Several post-war memoirs and interviews describe these missions not as glamorous or high-profile, but as essential, often improvisational operations that supported the broader Soviet war effort. Pilots recalled how stripped-down or repurposed Yak-1s flew in the dead of night, braved unfamiliar altitudes, or carried unorthodox payloads, not for fame, but because the front demanded it. In summary, the Yak-1's story is not confined to air-to-air duels or sweeping offensives. Beneath its more visible combat record lies a network of quiet contributions, experimental flights, recon sorties, and makeshift training programs. These rarely celebrated facets highlight the aircraft's durability, the ingenuity of its handlers, and the multidimensional nature of air power in a total war environment. Together, they complete the narrative of a fighter that served not just as a weapon, but as a versatile tool of Soviet endurance. The Yak-1's influence did not cease with its final sortie or retirement from service. Instead, its legacy became deeply embedded within the broader evolution of Soviet aviation doctrine, manufacturing principles, and post-war military-industrial development. While the aircraft itself did not transition into the jet age, the principles it embodied, rapid adaptability, practical construction, and pilot-centered design, left a permanent imprint on the Yakovlev Design Bureau and Soviet aircraft development well into the Cold War. The Yak-1 represented one of the earliest and most successful examples of an aircraft that was both a combat-ready tool and a developmental platform. The production practices refined during its mass manufacture informed the Soviet Union's post-war industrial strategy, which placed a premium on modularity, field serviceability, and standardization. These values became even more critical in the era of jet propulsion, where maintenance demands grew significantly and design tolerances became tighter. The Yakovlev Bureau's success in managing the wartime evolution of the Yak-1 into later models, such as the Yak-3 and Yak-9, served as a case study for how future Soviet fighters should be conceived, layered as families of aircraft sharing core systems and airframes that could be adapted to diverse combat roles. From a doctrinal standpoint, the Yak-1 era marked a departure from pre-war Soviet assumptions that favored quantity over quality and emphasized rigid, top-down control. The operational lessons drawn from the Yak-1 service, particularly its vulnerability in radioless early models and the high attrition rates of undertrained pilots, led to greater emphasis on pilot initiative, communication, and technical training in the post-war period. This shift in pilot development doctrine, though gradual, culminated in a generation of more tactically aware and independently capable aviators by the 1950s. Another enduring legacy of the Yak-1 lies in its contribution to Soviet combat identity and historical memory. Alongside the Il-2 Sturmovik, the Yak-1 became one of the visual and symbolic representations of Soviet resistance and eventual victory. Featured in wartime propaganda posters, films, and literature, the aircraft was often shown in idealized depictions of dogfights or protecting Red Army ground units. While such portrayals simplified the real complexity and challenges of wartime aviation, they helped instill a national narrative of defiance and technological self-reliance. In the post-Soviet era, the historical reassessment of the Yak-1 has deepened, particularly among aviation historians and restoration experts. Archival work has uncovered previously unknown production records, combat reports, and technical documents that offer a fuller picture of the aircraft's strengths and limitations. The contrast between propaganda and operational reality has become a subject of scholarly interest, enriching our understanding of how wartime mythologies were constructed and later revised. Some of these findings have informed museum exhibits, airshow reconstructions, and historical retrospectives, helping modern audiences appreciate the engineering ingenuity that went into creating the Yak-1 under extreme pressure. Moreover, the symbolic role of the Yak-1 as an aircraft that empowered women in combat aviation continues to receive international attention. The combat records of Lydia Litviak, Yekaterina Budanova, and other female pilots have been studied not only for their historical significance, but as case studies in gender integration, resilience, and propaganda usage. Their stories, intertwined with the Yak-1's operational history, have become points of reference in both military and gender history studies. The surviving aircraft, whether displayed in museums or flying in commemorative events, serve as physical bridges between generations. Reconstructed examples of the Yak-1, often built using surviving blueprints and original parts, have been painstakingly restored by aviation enthusiasts and historians in Russia, Europe, and North America. These aircraft, though few in number, allow for public engagement with the realities of WBU-era aviation. From the smell of oil to the cramped, armor-reinforced cockpits, in ways no textbook can convey. Ultimately, the Yak-1's legacy is multifaceted. It is not simply a story of an aircraft that held the line in 1941 or scored victories in 1943. It is a narrative of transformation, of a design process that matured through combat, of a nation that learned to fight through hardship, and of a fighter that helped shape the future of Soviet aviation. Its simplicity, strength, and adaptability made it more than a machine. It became a lens through which we can understand a pivotal era in military history. The Yak-1 gave the Soviet Union a chance not just to defend its skies, but to redefine them. Although production of the Yak-1 ceased in 1944 as more advanced models like the Yak-3 and Yak-9 took over, its impact was not erased by time. Thousands of Yak-1s had been manufactured, fought across every major Soviet front, and influenced not only tactical battlefield decisions, but the larger arc of Soviet aviation philosophy. However, the true value of the Yak-1 can also be measured by its broader influence, how it set the tone for post-war Soviet fighter development, and the enduring reverence it holds in the collective memory of the Russian aviation community. One of the most significant markers of its legacy lies in how its design lineage directly fed into the post-war Yakovlev fighters. Aircraft such as the Yak-15, one of the first Soviet jet fighters, borrowed heavily from the aerodynamic lessons and production strategies refined during the Yak-1 program. The shift from propeller-driven to jet-powered flight may seem dramatic, but the continuity of design logic, Emphasis on agility, pilot visibility, and maintainability remained central. The Yak-1 was not merely a wartime workhorse, it was a foundational reference point that bridged pre-war experimentation with Cold War-era innovation. As Soviet aviation entered the nuclear age and adopted supersonic platforms like the MiG-21 and Su-98, many veterans of the Yak-1 era remained in service as instructors, engineers, or design consultants. Their experiences shaped not only future tactics but institutional memory. Training manuals, doctrine texts, and tactical schools all incorporated combat lessons first learned in Yak-1 cockpits. Lessons about maneuverability, energy management, and team coordination. In this way, the Yak-1 helped institutionalize a combat philosophy that prioritized close-in dogfighting and high pilot autonomy, principles that endured long after the aircraft had left frontline service. Beyond its doctrinal footprint, the Yak-1 also holds a unique place in Soviet and Russian commemorative culture. Monuments across former Soviet territories feature replicas or stylized representations of the aircraft, often dedicated to the memory of fallen airmen or significant battles such as the defense of Leningrad or the skies over Kursk. In particular, memorials honoring Lydia Litviak and her female comrades often include Yak-1 imagery, reinforcing the fighter's status as a cultural and ideological symbol of wartime sacrifice and triumph. In aviation museums, particularly the Central Air Force Museum at Monino, and various regional war memorials, the Yak-1 is preserved not only as a machine but as an educational tool. Restored examples or detailed mock-ups are displayed to teach younger generations about the conditions of today's aviation. These exhibits typically emphasize the aircraft's rugged simplicity, its tight design tailored to rapid production, and its vital role during the years when Soviet victory seemed far from certain. In interviews and guided tours, curators often refer to the Yak-1 as the fighter of survival, a plane that didn't promise supremacy but delivered it through determination and endurance. There is also an ongoing effort among historical aviation circles to digitally preserve the Yak-1's legacy. Flight simulators, digital reconstructions, and historical archives continue to expand the accessibility of information about the aircraft. Virtual models based on archival blueprints allow for unprecedented technical exploration, while interactive educational platforms use the Yak-1 to teach both engineering fundamentals and wartime history to new audiences. As a result, the Yak-1 has found renewed relevance in the digital age, bridging generations and fostering cross-cultural appreciation of W2 aviation. In sum, the Yak-1's journey extends far beyond its operational lifetime. It did not disappear when newer aircraft entered service, nor was it forgotten after the war. Instead, it evolved into a symbol of persistence, adaptation, and quiet heroism. Its bones may no longer line airfields, but its spirit remains. Etched into museums, textbooks, monuments, and mines, it was not the fastest nor the most glamorous, but it was the aircraft that held the line when nothing else could. That is the true legacy of the Yak-1, a fighter that gave the Soviet Union not just a chance to survive, but the foundation to rise again. By the closing years of World War II, the Yak-1 had largely disappeared from frontline service, superseded by more advanced iterations like the Yak-3 and Yak-9. Yet the aircraft's significance remained firmly embedded in the Red Air Force's wartime evolution and in the memory of those who had relied on its performance during the most perilous days of the conflict. The Yak-1's retirement from combat did not signal the end of its role. It marked the beginning of its transformation into a subject of technical study, historical recognition, and national commemoration. In the immediate post-war years, the Soviet Union underwent rapid militarization and modernization. The technological demands of the emerging jet age rendered many piston engine fighters obsolete almost overnight. However, aircraft like the Yak-1 were not discarded lightly. For a time, remaining airframes were retained in reserve units or flight schools, where they trained a new generation of pilots on the fundamentals of aerobatics, navigation, and gunnery. These late career assignments allowed the Yak-1 to contribute quietly to Soviet air power long after its battlefield prime had passed. With the passage of time and the declassification of wartime documents, the Yak-1 began to emerge not just as a tool of war, but as an object of historical curiosity and national pride. Wartime pilots who had flown the aircraft wrote memoirs, shared interviews, and participated in military retrospectives, many of which emphasized the Yak-1's reliability, stability, and maneuverability compared to both Soviet and German contemporaries. These personal accounts, rich in technical insight and frontline experience, gave researchers and aviation enthusiasts a deeper understanding of the aircraft's performance in actual combat conditions. The post-Soviet era brought a renewed interest in the full scope of the USSR's contributions to victory in World War II. With that reevaluation came a reassessment of the aircraft that had formed the core of Soviet aerial resistance in the war's most desperate stages, no longer overshadowed by late war superlatives like the Yak-3 or the Il-2. The Yak-1 was increasingly recognized as the aircraft that bridged the gap between pre-war inadequacy and wartime effectiveness. Restoration projects, digital archives, and scholarly publications began focusing on its production numbers, battlefield statistics, and influence on post-war aviation design. This resurgence of interest extended to international audiences as well. Aviation historians in Europe and North America began to examine the Yak-1's role within the broader Allied context, recognizing it as a critical counterpart to Western fighters such as the Spitfire, Hurricane, and P-40. In particular, the Normandy Niemen Squadron, French pilots flying Yak-1s alongside Soviet forces, emerged as a focal point for cross-cultural remembrance. Exhibits at museums in both France and Russia often highlight this unique cooperation, with surviving or reconstructed Yak-1s taking center stage. Despite the scarcity of original airframes, technological advances in restoration and archival research have allowed a handful of Yak-1s to return to public view. Reconstructed using original blueprints and vintage parts, these aircraft serve not merely as museum pieces but as functioning memorials. At air shows and commemorative events, their slow but elegant flight profiles offer modern audiences a glimpse into the past, into the era when fragile wooden wings bore the hopes of an embattled nation. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Yak-1, Dean's Krem, lies not in any singular technological achievement, but in what it represents. It was not a perfect fighter, nor the most heavily armed or armored, but it was the right aircraft at the right time, born out of urgency, forged in crisis, and elevated by necessity. It represented the Soviet Union's capacity to adapt under pressure, to learn from failure, and to marshal limited resources toward effective and scalable solutions. That it succeeded, overcoming initial production flaws, operational setbacks, and immense material shortages, is a testament to both the design's soundness and the perseverance of the people who built and flew it. Today, the Yak-1 stands as a symbol of transition. From technological inferiority to competitive parity, from tactical desperation to strategic resilience. It is a story of industrial mobilization, of wartime improvisation, and of human ingenuity under fire. As long as its story is told in documentaries, museums, and restored aircraft, it will remain a key chapter in the history of military aviation. The Yak-1 did more than give the Soviet Union a chance. It helped ensure that the chance was not squandered.